Canadian history needs context. Is denialism violence or hate? Insights on the statements of Kimberly Murray, with special thanks to independent researcher Nina Green. Hi, my name is Michelle Sterling. I'm an independent researcher and writer. I am also a filmmaker, and I've done quite a bit of work on history, mostly Western Canadian history, and I'm quite appalled at some of the things that Kimberly Murray is saying about Canadian history, about Indian residential schools, and I think that many of her comments are the result of what is called presentism, judging the past by present standards. So I would like to present to you some of my insights that I think counter some of her comments. I think it's very important that we have more open public debate on issues of Canadian history. We cannot continue to have blood libels and defamatory statements thrown around at vast groups of people, denigrating Catholics, Christians of all denominations, and our Canadian forebears, our ancestors, the people who built this country. So let me walk you through the findings that I have, and I'd be happy to have any comments below and respond to them. Oh, by the way, I'll also post the PowerPoint on my Substack so that you can go through the links. So why should I speak about this? I'm not an academic. I did a series of historical documentaries in the 80s in Calgary with Dr. Hugh Dempsey as my supervisor, and he was married to Pauline Gladstone, and her father was Senator James Gladstone. I also worked on some historical miniseries and movie scripts with Claude Fournier and Marie-Josée Raymond in Quebec, and I later co-researched and wrote a documentary on genocide. I speak out because real harms are being done to Canadians and Canada due to residential school censorship. So calling people names like denier is hurtful and unhelpful to reconciliation. Domestic terrorism has flourished. More than 400 churches have been vandalized or burnt down since the release of the Truth and Reconciliation reports. But most media coverage is only on the more lurid claims about those schools, not the positive stories. Some 20 million Canadian Catholics and Christians have been blood libeled by atrocity claims, which are unproven in court, and the other 23 million Canadians deserve to know the facts and historical context. Some people are losing their jobs because they speak out, and children are being taught that our ancestors were monsters who preyed upon helpless victims, rather than that Canada was built on hundreds of years of shared trade and cultural crossovers. It's true, some people suffered greatly at Indian residential schools, but some people were rescued as orphans from destitute or neglectful homes. Some people's parents just wanted their kids to be able to make the just transition to the modern world. Education and acculturation are activities that all countries apply to children. That's not genocide. On April 17, 2026, Chiefs of Ontario posted this 5-minute video to YouTube. It takes longer to debunk than to accuse, so this video is longer. Kimberly Murray authored these reports and, according to an affidavit, also wrote the Truth and Reconciliation Commission reports. The Truth and Reconciliation reports covered statements from about 6,500 former students. Although that's a large number, it's only 4% of all the students who ever attended Indian residential schools. Positive comments in the reports were only nominally reported on in the media. And in 2015, Thompson Highway, a now world-famous former student, said, "You've heard 7,000 bad stories, but not the 7,000 good stories like his." It's very important to note that during the process of the Truth and Reconciliation research, 2 researchers contracted to interview former staff who would have provided the adult perspective were told that their budget was cut from $100,000 to $10,000 and that their interviews would not be transcribed. And the TRC cost $70 million. So Thompson Highway says that these were the happiest days of my life. He said, "You haven't heard the positive stories. There are many successful people today that went to those schools and have brilliant careers and are very functional people, very happy people like myself. I have a thriving international career, and it wouldn't have happened without that school." You have to remember, I came from so far north, there were no schools up there. So what was the purpose of Indian residential schools? To decimate or educate? I do not think, as a matter of fact, that the country ought to continuously protect a class of people who are able to stand alone. Duncan Campbell Scott. So here are two Mohawk Canadians, Emily Pauline Johnson, who was a very famous poet and who survived on her own devices, doing poetry readings all over the world, actually. And of course, Joseph Brant. Both of these people were devout Anglicans, and in 1892, Pauline Johnson shared a stage at the Young Men's Liberal Association event with Duncan Campbell Scott, who is also a poet, and she captivated the audience. So these were very, very capable people. Joseph Brant did go to an Indian residential school in the States. He was a bit older, and Emily Pauline Johnson went to a college. She was quite sick as a child, and apparently was more educated at home. Her family had a big library. Her father was a translator and very involved with the Anglican Church, and her mother was from Britain originally. So Kimberly Murray wants the government to criminalize me for the telling of these things to you. And in fact, we've seen recently that Dr. Frances Widdowson has been reviled in the press and dragged off by police and more recently arrested as well because she challenges the narrative on the Kamloops band's claim of 215 children being murdered and covertly buried in the apple orchard at Kamloops. But talking about the broader historical context of Canadian history is not a crime. It's essential for understanding. Presentism is the crime. Presentism is the problem. It's a historical distortion where we judge past figures solely by 21st century moral standards, ignoring the social norms of their time. You can't judge the past by today's standards. Kimberly Murray condemns Canada, claiming we committed crimes against humanity. But as a lawyer, she should know that in Canadian law, Section 11 of the Charter, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, people are presumed innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt through a trial and due process. Murray also claims that a group of Canadians have made it their job to try and deny that Indian residential schools happened, that bad things happened in these institutions, that children died at these institutions, and that children are buried on the grounds of the former institutions. I suspect that she's referring to the authors of these best-selling books. If so, the evidence does not support her claims. Historical context helps people understand the misconceptions advanced by mainstream media, and I recommend everyone go to the Indian Residential Schools Research Group and just click through these misconceptions and see what you're being misled about. One of the biggest gaps in the reporting on Indian residential schools and deaths is the forgotten plague, that being tuberculosis. I recommend that everyone watch this PBS documentary. Although it's set in the United States, the events and the findings parallel what happened in Canada. And this gives rise to reasons as to why some people might think that people disappeared. Because we often hear that from various former residential school students. They often say, oh, well, I was in a dormitory one day, and the next day the student next to me was gone. And I don't know why. They disappeared. So they may have been sent to a TB sanatorium in the days before the 1950s, before streptomycin and modern medications. People might be in TB sanatoriums for years, like 7 years in this case that I'm talking about here. So if you were a child of 7, you leave home, you go to Indian residential school, TB manifests itself. Probably you had latent TB because TB rates on reserve were extremely high, and many children carried the TB bacillus, but it wasn't activated. But perhaps at school it became activated, so you'd be sent off to a sanatorium. You might be there for years. In this case, the boy was there for 7 years. So when he finally was released from the sanatorium and was well, when he returned home, he had siblings that had been born in the meantime. The siblings who knew him when he left as a 7-year-old didn't know who he was as a 13-year-old. And this happened to many, many people on and off reserve. I have stories about people in Ireland who had very similar examples. And those were the times, that was the only treatment available, and that would be a reason why people felt that, people just disappeared. And occasionally, sadly, a person who went for treatment would have died, and they probably would have been buried near or at that location. TB was a huge public stigma in that time. It still is today, but in that time, it might mean, because people understood that TB was a contagion, so it was within your family likely, you might lose your job, you might lose your apartment, if people found out that you had someone in your family who died of TB. So sometimes people who died of TB, at the request of the family, were buried without a marker, so as not to have that social contagion and stigma put upon the family. So in this case, they say that their brother was away for 7 years, and when he came back, he was 13. He was a total stranger. They had a brother they never knew. And here's another reason why people in a community might think that children went missing at Indian residential schools. This happened in Fort Albany. A trader, trapper, a father, showed up saying there was no food in his family's tent. His wife was ill, and he died on the spot. Meantime, the Hudson Bay sent out men with food, only to find the family in a tent. The mother was deceased, 5 children around her, 2-month-old baby was given up to a relative, a 16-year-old joined others on a hunt. The remaining 3 children, a boy and 2 girls, came to the residential school, and during a flu epidemic, the youngest of the 3 died. So for that community, those children all disappeared to a residential school. And of course, they would never have come home in the summer, as was the normal custom with most children, because they were orphans. There was no one to receive them. So yes, they disappeared, but not for nefarious reasons. And we often hear that students who died at these schools were buried on the grounds. In some cases, that may be true in times when there was a mission and consecrated ground there, and the family was too far away or couldn't be notified in a timely way. But most of the children who died while enrolled, not necessarily at the Indian residential school, while enrolled, they were sent home for a burial on reserve. And we can see here Gladys Chapman. She died at the Royal Inland Hospital in Kamloops. She was registered at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. This was in 1931. She was a Roman Catholic, and her family were notified, and she was sent home to the Spasm Indian Burying Ground. So she's buried there, not at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. So if we look at the records, the Kamloops Indian Residential School records show that no children were buried at the school, and only 2 children died at the school. So you can go through all these names and see the many tragic reasons, fire at home, airplane crash, falling tree, a landslide, TB, which was very common, or its complications, sadly, a gunshot wound. And here we have Pearl Jo, who died from drowning. And so she was buried in Lytton, that's where she was from, and the school eventually built a pool to teach students how to swim. And more students here. And Adrian Reynolds George died from self-strangulation, sadly, after slipping off a box. And one suspects they might have been playing cowboys and Indians back in the day. But by the time adults came, it was too late. So only 2 children actually died at the Kamloops Indian Residential School, according to the records. And for those 2 deaths at the school, Pearl Jo and Adrian George, there were separate public inquests, media stories, and never any suggestion of foul play. Now, the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation is misleading Canadians. This report by James McCrae, former Attorney General of Manitoba, notes that the register lists people who never died in residential schools. And he notes that for reconciliation to mean anything, Canadians need truth, not myths. So he points out that some drowned or died in fires while at home. Some died in hospital of illness or injury. Some were killed in accidents in their home communities. And there was even a name on there like Willard Frank William lived full lives. He died in 2019 at the age of 85, but his name was also on this register. So why is that? Well, the Commission adopted a definition that counted a child as a residential school death if they died during the school year or within a year of being discharged, regardless of where or how the death occurred. And there's no list of names of the missing 215 children claimed by the Kamloops Band or others. And Dr. John K. Eunice, Chief Medical Examiner for the province of Manitoba, testified to the Canadian Senate that not having the names of the children who are suspected to have died in residential schools, we can't focus our search to identify these particular files quickly. So, just a comment there. There are millions and millions of death records. And what's the first thing that people do if someone in their family or another loved one, friend, goes missing? You call or go to the police to report a missing person, right? And what would be the first question that the police would ask? What's their name? Right? How can you find a missing person if you don't know their name? Because the name leads them to the network of family, friends, activities, job. That's how you find the person, or tragically sometimes find their remains. So without this list of names, claims of missing children are a phantom genocide. There are 1.2 million Indigenous Canadians, and only 1/3 of status Indians attended Indian residential schools on average for 4.5 years. And yet we are now up to about $60 billion in payouts for reconciliation. And we have strange things happening where elected officials are denigrating academic historians, eminent academic historians. So Professor Emeritus Jacques Rouillard is a historian. He wrote this article in the Dorchester Review, published in January 11th of 2022, that in Kamloops not one body has been found. Mark Miller, who was cabinet minister, and I believe he was actually Minister of Justice or something like that. Oh, at that time, he was Minister of Culture and languages. Anyway, he went after him. The Minister of Culture went after an eminent historian, claiming that he was distorting Canadians' understanding of history and that it was a ghoulish demand to see corpses. Nobody wants to see the corpses. People want evidence. They want a proper investigation. And meanwhile, Mark Miller's government did no due diligence before blindly accepting the Kamloops atrocity claim. Contrary to what Kimberly Murray claims, it is not hateful or violent to present historical facts and evidence. It's necessary. So let's look at this quote: "A people that has forgotten its traditions, its ancestors, and the sacrifices that brought its freedom is a people already conquered. For the man without memory is easily ruled, and the man without roots is easily led." Facts matter in this discussion. This is a book by Robert McBain, The Lonely Death of an Ojibwe Boy. You probably heard his name before, Charlie Wenjack. But McBain's book debunks the Gord Downey version of Charlie Wenjack's life and tragic death. In fact, at Cecilia Jeffrey Residential School, many of the kids sent thank you notes to the principal and his wife addressed to "Dear Mom and Dad," and they signed it with "Love," as reported in his book. So it's true that some children had a terrible time and were abused at school, sometimes by staff, sometimes by other students. But many of the children were orphans, some 30%. Where else would they go? And no wonder their memories are dark with images of graves and death. And yes, there were perpetrators. No one should deny that. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission cites some 31 perpetrators who were convicted and served time or faced other consequences for their offenses over the course of 113 years in 139 schools. So, of course, Indigenous activists will claim that this is a small number, and that's because the system wasn't working. But supporters will say these findings show that the priests, the nuns, the clergy, Indigenous teachers and workers, and others were overall decent individuals, totally dedicated to the care of their small charges. And as I mentioned about presentism before, these were different times and difficult communications. So Murray claims that children were taken to the residential schools and then transferred to all kinds of other institutions. Well, if you transfer me to a TB sanatorium for care, I would thank you. So that was careful due diligence and caring for the children. And then she's saying that communities right now are working on searches of the grounds of Indian residential schools. But as I just showed you, most of the children were buried on their home reserve. And she claims that they know that children were taken to sanatoriums, Indian hospitals, and reformeries, and children died there too. I'd say that's true. And then she says the kids were never returned home. Well, or that the parents were not told where they were when they died and not told where they were buried. So let's have a look at the Ponoka Mental Hospital as an example. You have to remember that even back in the 60s and 70s, communication and travel were nothing like they are today. So there was distance, loss of family ties. If you had a member of your family who was mentally disabled or mentally ill, as I mentioned before, if you had TB, you might become an outcast of your family and a ward of the state. And as a ward of the state, the government did the best that it could to maintain you. But that might mean moving you around the country to a facility best suited for your needs. And so we have here a record of the fact that people did die at the Ponoka Mental Hospital in Ponoka, which is now called Centennial Center, but they were buried in the Forest Home Cemetery in Ponoka. So, if you are not connected to your family, or if they want to distance themselves from you for the reasons I mentioned, then then you wouldn't have a proper burial. I mean, you would have a proper burial, but you wouldn't have proper records. And it says right here, if the families could not afford to take the body back or the family could not be found, the province held responsibility for the burial, which usually meant burial in a local designated cemetery. So I think that would be the case in most of the institutions that Murray talks about. I think that this is very pertinent to our situation right now. In my study of communist societies, I came to the conclusion that the purpose of communist propaganda was not to persuade or convince, not to inform, but to humiliate, and therefore, the less it corresponded to reality, the better. When people are forced to remain silent, when they are being told the most obvious lies, or even worse, when they are forced to repeat the lies themselves, they lose once and for all their sense of probity. That would be their moral construct of, honesty, integrity, etc. To assent to obvious lies is, in some small way, to become evil oneself. One's standing to resist anything is thus eroded and even destroyed. A society of emasculated liars is easy to control. I think if you examine political correctness, it has the same effect and is intended to. Think about that for a minute. So contrary to Murray's claim, Canada cares. She claims that Canada continues on this path of pretending this didn't happen. She claims that Canada as a whole has committed crimes against humanity, and she claims that disappearing people is a crime against humanity, and we need to care about that. In fact, Canada made every effort to reconcile. Taxpayers, that's you, have paid out compensation for over $3.23 billion for 27,846 former students who claimed significant abuse under the independent assessment process. No one was disappeared in the Argentinian sense of the word, and most importantly, everyone is innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. And the independent assessment process was not really kosher, in my view. You can read about it in Truth and Indignation. Ronald Neisen is one of the few people who followed this process and wrote about it. He's a law professor and anthropologist. And it's very clear that lack of due process in the IAP procedures means that thousands of Canadians have been falsely accused or actual perpetrators have not been punished. As the IAP did not follow due process or evidence-based law, we now have on record the names of some 5,315 persons of interest. The IAP claims were addressed on the basis of probability. The accused were not allowed to defend themselves, and the accuser was not required to attend the hearing. That's completely contrary to all basic principles of law. And this is an interesting tidbit that Alex Zoltan brought to my attention. A convicted murderer helped fill out IAP forms in one instance. So this happens to be on the same day that the Kamloops Indian Band announced the finding of 215 children's remains in the former apple orchard of the former Kamloops Indian Residential School. That same day, the BC Law Society released a disciplinary ruling on a lawyer who had hired a convicted murderer to act as a form filler for clients making claims of the independent assessment process. And this was for people in the Williams Lake region who would have attended the St. Joseph's Indian Residential School, which was also known as Caribou. So this was for some 624 clients. The claims averaged $112,000 each, and he received more than $10 million in legal fees from the Canadian government. And the Kamloops announcement overshadowed this story. And during the process, several clients had contacted the law firm saying that the form filler, convicted murderer, was demanding a portion of their settlement fee, and many were frightened because they knew he had a violent past. Now, these accusations have not been proven, but on recognition of these matters, the man was reincarcerated. And interestingly enough, there's a significant disparity of $21,000 between the average compensation of people in the IAP process and that paid out to this lawyer's clients who were aided in form filling by a convicted murderer. In other words, they got $21,000 more. And I think the most important thing that people need to recognize is that Kamloops atrocity propaganda of the 215 dead children is what pushed UNDRIP through the Senate. There was no evidence, there was no due diligence, no sober second thought on their part. And unfortunately, UNDRIP debases property rights and Canada's Constitution. Now, of course, it was very emotional. Everyone, I think, was swept away by the news, especially the way the news was presented as if fact. And sadly, Senator McCallum was actually orphaned and went to an Indian residential school, I think around age 5 or 6, which was a couple of years younger than the ordinary admission of 7 years. So, that was probably a very difficult time for her and probably brought back terrible memories, loneliness, loss. And all the other senators, were assuming that to honor the lost children of Kamloops, many more angels, whose voices I expect we'll hear from soon, people started assuming that there would be thousands of children found in other places. In fact, many other schools reported that they had found unmarked graves. But these unmarked graves were in old, abandoned cemeteries. So this is the whole land back deal from UNDRIP. And certainly there should have been sober second thought on that. But there was not. And elected officials promote sugarcane, a blood libel against some 20 million Catholic and Christian Canadians. This is appalling in my view. David Eby actually showed sugarcane in the BC legislature. Mark Miller here is pumping the film Sugarcane, a passionate and powerful documentary about St. Joseph's Mission Residential School. Well, I made a mini documentary to rebut this blood libel. In the story, the premise is that babies that were born to students at the school were illicit offspring of priests who'd impregnated the girls, and that the babies were burned, incinerated in the school's garbage burner. And the supposed proof of this is Ed Archie Noisecat, the father of filmmaker Julian Brave Noisecat. And the claim is that Ed is the only baby known to have survived the incinerator. What they don't tell you in the film was that it was Ed's own mother, Antoinette Archie, Julian's grandmother, who put Ed in the incinerator. She was an unwed mother at the time. The perpetrator was not a priest. His name was Ray Peters. He was 11 years older than her. And they went on to have, I believe it was 8 more children together. And Ray himself had at least 17 other children with 5 different women. So Ray was a tomcat. And the story, Sugarcane, is beautifully shot. It won many, many awards. National Geographic picked it up. But it's filled with innuendo. And the 1 or 2 facts that are true form the basis of a film that completely misleads the public, enrages the public, actually. If I saw that and I didn't know the historical facts that I do, I'd be furious. So anyway, please do watch my little mini documentary, no budget mini documentary, thanks to my many friends who helped me with it. And see for yourself and look at the evidence. But I think it's really a shame that none of our elected officials are doing any due diligence. And really, within that film, there's actually a song that Ed and his son are singing as they drive along, that Canada is all Indian land. Well, the land back movement is not about reconciliation or truth. It's a red-green alliance intent on the destruction of North America. And you're funding your own country's destruction, in my opinion. And ironically, Kimberly Murray's Special Interlocutor's office was not located in Canada. This is the notice on the land where it was. So draw your own conclusions. Now, Francis Widdowson and Albert Howard have been writing about the Aboriginal industry for some time. This was published in 2008. So you can understand why people who are profiting from the Aboriginal industry, the grievances about Indian residential schools, you can see why they would want to shut her up. But these are important matters. They're in the public interest. No one should be censored or jailed for asking questions about genocide narratives, the disappeared, the lack of names of those alleged to be the missing 215 children, the lack of families stepping up with evidence of a missing child, and the billions of dollars paid by taxpayers to lawyers and elites, while ordinary Indigenous people live in poverty on reserve. Indigenous payouts and contingent liabilities are now more than Canada's defence budget for 1.2 million Indigenous people, most of whom still live in poverty on reserve. What is going on? So Thomas Sowell had a very good quote here. The concept of microaggression is just one of the many tactics used to stifle differences of opinion by declaring some opinions to be hate speech, instead of debating those differences in a marketplace of ideas. To accuse people of aggression for not marching in lockstep with political correctness is to set the stage for justifying real aggression against them. And we have seen this with Dr. Widdowson. She's gone to a number of different university campuses to do what she calls street spectrum something that I can't say. Street spectrum epistemology. Anyway, and it's really it's a method, I believe it was developed by Peter Boghossian, who's a U.S. philosopher. And the idea is that to lay out a series of a spectrum of views. Are you neutral? Do you disagree? Do you agree strongly or nominally? And what is your evidence? So it's an interactive dialogue process to help people come to see that they may believe something firmly, but what's the evidence? And maybe there is evidence. If so, let's see it. Anyway, she's been wildly attacked by raging mobs at most of the universities she's gone to. And in the most recent incident, she was arrested at the University of Lethbridge for having coffee with a student there. Now, factually, she had been issued a trespass notice by the University of Lethbridge. They didn't want her to come there. But it is a public facility. She is a taxpayer. She is a former academic. And she was having a coffee with a student. So unlike the last time when the university itself had rather, in my view, incited students to come and virtually riot in front of her, this time there was no one there but she and a student, and this time the police arrested her for trespass. But the point is really, it does set the stage for justifying real aggression against them. And I think that's also what Kimberly Murray is doing. In my opinion, by Kimberly Murray having held such a high-profile position and then calling people like me denier, claiming that I'm filled with hate or that I'm a violent person, I think that that incites violence against people like me. Obviously, I care about Indigenous people. I think it's terrible that so many people live in despair. I think it's a huge tragedy that hundreds of children are dying on the streets, especially in Vancouver, of fentanyl overdoses. And a lot of the big drug problems in Canada, if you look at the timeline, really took off about the time that the very high independent assessment process compensation payments were being made. So people were getting $250,000 as a settlement. Many of these were people who hadn't handled large sums of money ever before in their life. And Ronald Neisen reports in his book how people said, oh yeah, I used to do crack, but when I got my settlement, I could afford cocaine. So I think that a lot of the criminal gangs and the drug industry really took off based on settlements meant to help people recover from the trauma that they had suffered. And instead, we've ended up traumatizing millions more individuals and families across the country. And my theme is that every living child matters most of all. That's where we should be putting our attention, not in the graves of the past. So if you'd like to learn more about Indian residential school history, I recommend that you go on Nina Green's site and have a look. There's lots of material here: staff chronicles, student activities, reunions. How many genocides have a reunion? Applications, attendance forms, quarterly returns. Most of these are real government records that you can look at, and they're organized in a way that it's quite easy to understand. Medical records and the death records. So here you will be able to see the death records of students from many of the schools, what they died of, where they were buried, whether or not their parents were notified. And of course, this last part on Kamloops does a very thorough discounting of the claim that the GPR operator found any sign of bodies in the or graves in the Kamloops Indian Band's orchard there by the former Kamloops Indian Residential School. What that section does is it discusses the fact that in the 1920s there were 2,000 feet of septic trenches dug right in the same spot where all of these alleged graves were supposedly found. So actually our children at school are tying little orange ribbons to fences to commemorate septic trenches. That's really the big travesty of all of this. And just for fun, under Staff Chronicles on that same site, you can go to some new files. These are the Sisters of St. Anne Chronicles. And so there's dozens and dozens of pages covering all these years, but you can see what life was like there at the Indian Residential School, 1960 to 61. Well, the dancing troupe had just returned from the Pacific National Exhibition performance in Vancouver. They had now complete cafeteria service with a dishwasher. The living rooms of students have new furniture, very attractive and colorful. Each has a television set, new beds and mattresses in the junior girls and junior boys dorms, heavy enrollment. Doesn't sound like genocide to me. So I think we have to consider the fact that this may be part of a war without rules against Canada, that this is ideological subversion and psychological warfare. It changes the perception of reality to such an extent that despite the abundance of information, no one is able to make sensible conclusions in the interests of defending themselves, their families, their community, and their country. Think about that for a moment. And I'd like to ask you to help me to do more of this work. Help me stop the gravy train and restore context to Canadian history. on my website, michellesterling.com, I have 2 reports. One's called Ambiguous Losses, and it discusses the fact that I do believe that the Indigenous community is really suffering, largely because of the many ambiguous losses that have happened, especially in recent years. You know, fentanyl deaths where a person's there one day, gone the next. Young people, beautiful young people, lost with this terrible drug, alcohol, suicide. These are extremely painful kinds of deaths. You know, it's not like when your grandmother or grandfather passes away, someone who's lived a full life, you see them quietly fading. It's sad, but it's a natural ending. These are tragic and heart-rending. Many times, children are being left behind, orphaned. And years ago, they might have been orphaned by tuberculosis. Now they're being orphaned by fentanyl. And grandparents are being, forced to take up the burden of care of orphaned children. And it's great that so many are stepping up to do that, but it's very burdensome. And as I said, many people on reserve are living in abject poverty while these billions of dollars being paid out by Canadian taxpayers are floating around in somebody's pockets, but it's not getting to the people who really need it and deserve it. And we keep hearing more about, people living 15 to a house on reserve. There's not enough housing. What's happening with those billions of dollars? These are all perfectly valid questions, and they're not meant to incite hatred or violence against anyone, because there's a lot of very innocent victims out there. So I do ask, if you can, to help me do more of this work. And if you would like to know the truth about the media coverage, have a look at my other report, which is Confronting Indian Residential School Confabulation and Media Irresponsibility. So this responds to a report by Gerbrand and Sean Carlton, who claimed that, nobody ever said there was a mass grave. Well, that's just ridiculous. The media says it over and over again, and you can see that in my report. And not to mention the Assembly of First Nations has also enshrined the claim of 215 dead children and mass graves in a number of their resolutions. And, of course, the AFN, the Assembly of First Nations, is also funded by taxpayers. So these are all perfectly valid questions, and I hope that you'll keep asking them. So I hope you can help me, because I'm doing this more or less alone. Thanks very much for listening to this presentation.